In this video I'm gonna show you how to use the new input system to set up the movement for our new top-down 2D game. This will work with a keyboard, gamepad, and even multiple joysticks. So, let's go! Let's start off by creating a new project. For this one I'm gonna use Unity 2022.3.14. You can use a different version, but there might be slight issues and differences. And the pipeline I'm gonna use is Universal 2D. Then we'll assign the project name, and let's disconnect all the cloud features. Once the project is opened, let's go to Window, Package Manager, and make sure that 2D and Universal Render pipeline is installed. Once you have that, let's close this window and start working on the game itself. First of all, let's create a folder for the scripts, and I'm gonna put an underscore in its name just to make sure it shows up as the first folder. Now it's time to create our player. So let's create an empty game object, call it player, then let's right click it and add a 2D circle to it, just so we have a visual representation and we know where the player is. Now we can finally start coding. Let's go into a scripts folder and create a new C# script called mover. This is going to be a base class which is going to contain all the logic that's related to moving the objects around. Now let's open the script, remove all the code that we don't need, and just to maintain good practices and keep the code clean and organized, let's immediately add the class to a namespace called topdown.movement. For this project we're going to be using physics to move the objects around, so we're going to need a variable to store the rigid body 2D component of the object. Inside the wait method we're gonna get access to it using getComponent, and just to make sure that the object will have a rigid body 2D, let's use the requireComponent attribute. If you're not familiar with this attribute, basically when we will add this script to an object that doesn't have a rigid body 2D component, it will automatically add one, and when we're trying to remove the rigid body 2D component, it will not allow us because this script requires it. Next up, we need to know in which direction this object is moving and how quickly. So for this purpose, let's create a private vector free called current input and a private float called movement speed, which is going to be serialized, and this is going to allow us to tweak it inside the editor. Now, to modify the object's velocity, we're going to need to create a fixed update method. Here you only need one line of code. Body.velocity equals to movement speed multiplied by the current input and multiplied by time.fixedDeltaTime. Now let's go back into Unity, and we could actually assign the mover script to the player object, but we still need to get the input from somewhere. So for this purpose, let's create a new script. Let's call this one player movement, and it's going to inherit from the mover class. Let's open the script, delete all the unnecessary code, and instead of monoBehavior, let's type in mover. You can see this name is not recognized, and we have two options here. The first one is to add using topdown.movement, and the second one is to include the class itself in this namespace. The second option seems better in this case because the player movement logically should also be a part of the movement namespace. So let's include the class inside the namespace and remove the using statement that I wrote earlier. Alright, now that we have this done, we need to get the input from somewhere. So let's handle this issue right now. We want to be using the new input system, so first we need to make sure that we have the package installed. Let's get back into Unity, choose the player object, and now we can finally drag the player movement script on top of it. You're gonna see that it's gonna add automatically a rigid body 2D component. So let's make sure that we assign the movement speed. For now I'm gonna set it to 10, but we're gonna change it later. And also it's very important to set the gravity scale to 0, otherwise the circle is just gonna fall down when you start the game. Now let's open the package manager and make sure that the new input system is installed. If you don't see it, try checking inside the Unity registry. The package is gonna start installing, and at some point you're gonna get a warning that says that you have to restart the editor. Just press yes and wait for a bit.
One eternity later.
Once the editor has restarted, we can start implementing the input system. So let's choose the player object and open the player movement script. Here we're gonna make sure to require a component of type player input. And initially this class is not going to be recognized, but if you add using Unity engine.input system, the problem is going to be solved. Alright, once you're done typing this, let's go back into Unity and add the player input component to the player object. Now, just because I like to keep the scripts that I created on the bottom, I'm gonna move the player movement script down. But now I want you to notice one thing. Inside the player input we have no input actions. So let's solve this problem by pressing the create actions button. And here let's create a folder called input and let's change the file name to player input. Once you hit save, the actions are gonna open automatically and you'll see that we have two predefined action maps, player and UI. At the moment we only need the player action map, so let's delete the second one. Inside the player action map we have three predefined actions, move, look and fire. For this episode we only need move, so let's delete the second and the third. Now let's take a quick glance at the move action. First of all, you're gonna see that it will return a value of type vector2. Inside you're gonna see that we have a couple predefined bindings that will allow us to receive this input. So first of all we have the gamepad stick, then the keyboard including WASD and the arrow keys, also an XR controller and a joystick. So this is perfect for us, let's see how this works in action. Also remember to save the asset either manually or by pressing save when this message pops up. Now let's open the player movement script and inside it let's create a private void called onMove. Autocomplete will try to convince you that it's wrong and it's actually onAnimatorMove, but you have to tell it no.
And you gotta tell him no.
The name has to be spelled exactly like this with a capital O and a capital M, and as an input parameter we'll pass in an input value called value. Inside the method we will create a new vector-free variable called player input, and then we can use the value.getVector2 to get the x and y parameters of the input. The z parameter is gonna stay 0 for obvious reasons. This is a 2D game and we don't want to be moving forward or backwards. The last step is to take this value and assign it to the current input. So let's go into the mover class and change the current input from private to protected. Just a brief explanation. The player movement class basically inherits from the mover class. So we can access the same variables, but for that to happen we need to set the variable to protected. And now we can just type in current input equals to player input and it's gonna work. Before we finish the video you still might have questions regarding the onMove method. How does it work when it has 0 references and we didn't mention it anywhere? The short and practical answer here would be that you can reference any of your actions inside your code by creating a method called on followed by the name of your action. For example, I created two extra actions. The methods would be called onMove, onFire, and onJump. Anytime the player will press an input key, the player input will send messages to the game object, and all the scripts attached to this game object will receive these messages, in this case the player movement script. If you want to understand the new input system better, I recommend you check out this Samyam video. She explains it very well and also outlines multiple ways of working with the input system, not just this one. But yeah, once you have all of this in place, you can safely go back into Unity, press play, and you'll see the player moving around, although it might be very slowly. So you can bump up the movement speed as I did here to 500 and then 200, and it will work great. It even works with a gamepad. I want to thank everyone that made it this far and announce that I'm gonna become a full-time content creator and indie game developer. So you'll definitely get a lot more videos in the near future. If you want to sponsor me on Patreon or become a YouTube member, that will help me out a lot, because right now we only have one, and I would love for that number to increase. That's it for this video, stay tuned for the next one.